A book like this is obviously very tricky to adapt because right off the bat, the book starts with a young protagonist who's 6 years old, and by the end of the book, he's 13. And right off the bat, you're going, oh well, what do I do? Cast a 6-year-old, then an 8-year-old, then a 10-year-old, then a 13-year-old, and that's never going to fly in a 2-hour movie because you're changing actors on an audience, and it's tricky to bond with this kid anyway in the beginning because he does some things that are not particularly pleasant. But that was part of the real attraction for me about this story, is that this is not just a good protagonist who has something terrible happen to them and then spends the rest of the movie finding a way to set the world right. This is a story about a boy who's essentially in conflict with his own capacity for empathy and his equal but opposite capacity for aggression. And we as human beings are so capable of such kindness, and yet we are capable of terrible mass destruction. And it felt to me, reading the book, that these ideas of what we are as human beings are distilled into this young boy. And that is effectively his journey, is to find his own moral compass. So my feeling was, you got to find an actor who can handle that moral ambiguity and that complex emotional range, because he's a tricky character to bond with. I remember coming to Linda and saying, I'm going to put him in every single scene of the movie. That's my take. And I think I didn't know that people had tried a lot of other takes, and they tried to have him not too often in the movie, put a lot of other characters around. The problem with that is you're trying to come to grips with this kid's dual nature.
What is it about schools and youngsters being primed for violence that kind of, there's a lot of ethical exploration that can be done there. Is that one of the things that you guys think, the producers, that?
Violence is such a part of growing up. It's the moment I think everybody realizes they lose a certain amount of innocence when they realize they could be threatened, or people they care about could be threatened, or they could be the bully. They could also be the one with the, as Gavin says, capacity for violence. And I people have asked me, not just on this film, but other films, why I'm interested in the topic. And I think, and sometimes they say, because you're a woman. Why are you interested in violence? What draws people to violence, particularly in schools? What draws young people to create families outside of probably the family at home that's not so good? They find something protective here. And it's that dual nature of protection, but what we propagate is violence, is fascinating to me as somebody who's, I don't have children, but maternal. What is the world that we are raising kids in? What are we teaching people? How do we use moments of violence to have an educational moment? And I think that that's probably one of the things that women love about this book.
This one, more than any story I know, had to find a way to deliver on the genre of spectacle, science fiction, action, but it's essentially very much a character story with some incredibly complex themes. Sure. So I think Gavin figured it out somehow.
Well, I had a lot of debate with my producers over it. I mean, I will just say to that part of what we're trying to do here is perhaps a little bit manipulative. It's a sleight of hand. This is a story about kids embracing games that can be violent. And I'm fascinated by the way games and reality are starting to merge in terms of the way video games are more and more photoreal, but reality is more and more game-like. We watch wars on TV. We see it on CNN. We fight with drones. We can be detached from the battlefield. And I think Lynn raises an incredibly important point, is how do you give this audience what, unfortunately, they expect on some level? I say unfortunately on some level. What they expect is to get a rush from seeing things blow up and action. And that final moment, even Ender, with all the empathy that he's slowly discovering, has this moment of ego.
There were many, many challenges. I think probably the biggest challenge was that Gavin asked for just an incredible breadth in this movie. Sometimes you do a movie where you have a particularly hard thing to achieve, and you put a ton of resources, energy, and you solve that problem, and you capitalize later on and go, yeah, give me more shots, right? But Gavin just had more and more different ideas. It's like, oh, one of those and one of those, and we have zero gravity, and there's a queen, and there's an Eros, and there's a formic planet, and so now you've got
destroy the formic
yeah, and they kept getting more and more. But so we started off with just a huge plate to attack, and then each one of those was really hard. I mean, like zero gravity is a very, very hard thing to achieve when you're stuck with gravity, and having a queen, an 8-foot bug that is ant-like or termite-like, and yet has to have all these emotions. I need her to be vulnerable. I need her to be aggressive. I gotta be scared
He's
of her,
still
but
my
have
friend.
empathy. You know?
He's more my friend.
But yet she doesn't have any eyelids. She can't blink. She can't weep. She doesn't have a mouth. You know,
No
and
mood ring.
no, yeah, exactly. So then you have to, you ask your animators, your animation leads to please convey all these things that Gavin's demanding, but this is your tool. This is what she has.
Demanding, asking, Matthew, gently asking.
Dictator. No, director. Sorry, same thing.
I would say this is one of, if not the most ambitious films we've ever worked on in the last 20
totally
years. And that's saying a lot. I mean, that's a big thing. And, with these kinds of films, I think another really interesting challenge that we had is we say there's really no such thing as post-production anymore. And this kind of film really defies the kind of conventional, development, prep, shoot, post kind of model. And for Gavin, in so many ways, the directing doesn't stop on the last shoot day, right? There really is physical production and digital production, and both are inextricably linked. And in many cases, the entire scene is generated in a computer, or there are actors against a green screen, and the world around them is being generated. And it's so ambitious, and there's so many layers, and there's so much going on that it's like three-dimensional chess, I think. I think for Gavin, he's got the hardest job of anybody on any film as the writer and the director of that story world. And the other thing is, like, when we read these scripts and we read Gavin's story and his adaptation, the words on the page all kind of conjure up different images in our mind's eye. And as we all sit around and talk, we realize we're all going in different places. And so I think another wonderful thing we're able to do on this picture is during the development process, literally put the power of these digital tools in Gavin's hands to realize the visual language of the movie before we go into production. So in many ways, he's the architect of the story's world, and now we're all on the same page, and we know what that battle room looks like in zero gravity. We have a blueprint of Gavin's design. We have no question what's going to happen when we go in there. So as we move into physical production, we're not trying to figure that out in that moment. It's really Gavin focusing on the performance with these kids.
In the book, the battle room takes place in a black, those who've read the book, it takes place in a black box. And when you read the book, you don't mind, and the battles are fascinating. But when you sit down adapting the script or talk to your visual effects supervisor, you actually have to realize, okay, I've gone up into space, and now I'm going to be in a zero-gravity black box, which is great from a budget point of view, and sucks visually, right? Because 4 scenes are taking place in that space, and each one is going to look horribly familiar or similar. So what we did, the first thing is I said, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? And one day I came in and I said to Ben Proctor, Ben, it's a glass sphere, and we can change the mood, what Matthew was talking about, in that space, in every single scene. And I went to the producers, and then when Matthew came on, and everybody looked at me and said, that sounds great, but you know how much that's going to cost. And that's the problem, because you're expecting one thing as a producer, and then when you change that idea, I think for the better, because we were able to do each of those scenes with a different lighting, it does impact your budget. And in fact, the truth is we had 5 scenes in that, and we dropped one in order to do 4 really well with our resources and how to maximize those resources. And I think it was better for the pace of the movie anyway in the end. And then you come to Matthew and say, okay, well, that's zero gravity out of the way. Now we need a room which in the book is about kids playing on a computer in the final simulation. He plays a computer game. And I remember going, how are we going to make this visual? It's a kid sitting at a computer terminal fighting with his keyboard a war in space. And I was with my kids at the planetarium, and we sat down, and I remember coming to you with this and said, I was at the planetarium, and there's a huge projector, and it's all black around, and we can do this all in the round, but we need him in a huge cave, and I saw this conductor at the Disney Concert Hall conducting, and we put Ender in the middle, and again, this is what you're dumping on these guys. Okay, there's a conductor in the middle of a huge cave, and it's black, and there's a projector, and when it goes down, but we can't project it on the roof, I want it to be virtual reality all around him, so he's literally immersed in the game. Why did I want to do this book? Because first I was drafted, as you know it, when I was 17 years old, which was very young.
In South Africa.
In South Africa. I was drafted, and it was I was in for 2 years. I lost a dear friend, etc., etc. Came out very angry, very confused, and politically awakened, if you will, and yet wrestling with a great deal of these issues that I think are in this book, which is the trusting of authority, one's own capacity for aggression, all of these things about which way will I, what path will I take now that I'm not at all sure whether I trust authority at all, and who do I turn to? So I think those themes resonate strongly. I think they also resonate strongly in terms of bullying. And young kids, when we're older, and I'm a parent now, want to think that kids are somehow more stable than we were, or think, no, at that age, from sort of 10 and in your teens and through to your early 20s, is an exceptionally intense time. So for me, it was about speaking to a group that is often, in my view, not spoken to in cinema. And we're getting our most positive response from that age group, which is the 10 to 15-year-old group, who are beginning to grapple with big ideas, but are still struggling with nuance. And so when you adapt a book like this, where do you pitch it? Do you pitch it at the 65-year-old philosopher king? Or do you pitch it at the 13-year-old who's represented in that film, who's more intelligent than we give them credit for, but is still at that very vulnerable age where things are felt intensely, things should be right, things should be wrong, and yet you're asking that age group to deal with moral complexity. So what's most exciting for me about the film and the response we get is when I'm approached on a soccer field the other day. A woman comes up to me and says, "Did you direct Ender's Game?" I go, "Oh boy, this is a fan of the book, they're going to hate me for a moment." And she says, "I just want to say, I took my son, he's 10, smart 10, she says, but I took him, and we had the best conversation we've ever had." And I'm not meaning to sell it in that way, but it's interesting that part of what drove all of us was the conversations that we've had with younger people. And I think that was the idea, was how to pitch these ideas at a high level, but not so high that they miss their prime target audience.